I'm Jacob Krueger, and this is the Write Your Screenplay podcast. This episode is coming to you from my hotel room at the Sundance Film Festival, and this is going to be my second annual Lessons from Sundance episode. In this episode, what I'm going to be doing is talking about some of the really incredible films that I've seen here at Sundance, and without giving any spoilers, talking to you about the things that you can learn from them as screenwriters. So first up is my ultimate proud papa moment. My student and now faculty member, Erin Brown-Thomas, premiered a movie here called Chasers. Chasers is a incredible directorial feat. In fact, some of you heard my podcast with Erin Brown-Thomas where we talked about it. It's a oneer. If you're a screenwriter and you're new to directing, what a oneer means is that the entire episode is shot in one continuous shot. It's 30 minutes. It's a 30-minute pilot. And this is something you very rarely see because it's so challenging technically. But it's something you even more rarely see in a low-budget, self-produced pilot. We're used to seeing these kinds of bold, challenging technical decisions made in shows like The Bear, where in fact there's an episode that is a oneer that is famously noted as a oneer because nobody does this. And there's so much I'd like to tell you about this, but I want you to see it for yourself. So we're not going to get into the structure of the story, the way the characters are built. Instead, we're going to talk about how do you build the world. Erin's decision to shoot the entire episode in one shot is not an accident. It's not a gimmick that she's layered on top of her pilot. Rather, it's something that's organically growing out of the pilot, and it's growing out of the theme that she's exploring. She's struggling with a question that we all struggle with at some point in our career, and that she has struggled with in her own career, which is, am I chasing a dream? Or am I just getting fucked? And those aren't my words, those are Erin's words for why she wanted to write this story. Because what she saw was a parallel between the experience of a emerging actor, an emerging producer, an emerging writer, an emerging star, right? She saw a parallel between the complicated relationships that we as artists have with the industry and the relationships that we have, the interpersonal relationships, the love relationships that we have. And the question she's asking is, are we in a negative relationship? Are we in an abusive relationship with our business? Or are we chasing our dreams and paying our due? The idea for the oneer grows out of this. It's a wonderful challenge directorially to do this. But what the oneer allows you to do is to follow a character's perspective, and then another character crosses and you're following their perspective. Then another character crosses and you're following their perspective. And what we're doing is we're getting dips and tastes of the world of this party. But there are elements that are hidden from us. There are elements that we don't understand. We can only see where the camera goes. And what that does is it gives us a feeling of both what we're seeing and what we're not seeing. And this is also connected to the main character's journey. The main character is finding her way through her own story, and there's a part of her story that she's not willing to look at because she's chasing a dream so badly that she doesn't want to look at the reality. Or maybe she's haunted by a fear that the reality is darker than she wants to imagine, right? This is the question Erin is asking. And we don't really get to any kind of resolution until the very end of the piece when the character does. What's really cool about this is that as we travel through this Hollywood party, as we are watching these characters on their journey, on their evening, we are picking up and letting go of these threads of story. And each time we come back to another character, we're picking up the story and we're going, oh, I see. There's another layer I wasn't looking. What I love about Erin's work is that the screenplay is not saying Hollywood's an abusive relationship. This movie is not saying just chase your dreams. And this movie is also not saying just let them go. What this movie is actually saying is, how do we know the difference between what we are projecting out into the world and what's really happening, what we want to see and what we're really experiencing? When do we know that it's time to double down, that these are just the challenges that we go through along the way? And when do we actually have to leave? How do you recognize abuse when you want something so bad? And when you know that thing is hard, right? So she's asking all these really complicated questions. And the concept that I want you to take from that is every element in your screenplay, your pilot, your play, your movie, your novel, whatever you're writing, every single element is a part of the function of the piece. There's a concept. One of my great mentors was a guy named Bill Cook, a brilliant professor of poetry at Dartmouth College. And Bill always used to say, in the best poems, form is function. In other words, there is no difference from the form your piece takes and the function of what that's going to deliver. And I believe the same thing is true about screenplays. In fact, I believe that screenplays and poetry actually have a lot more in common than screenplays and, for example, novels. Because a poem, every line, every choice, every image, right, needs to do a tremendous amount of work. Every single time you write a comma or a period, every time you hit return and create a space, every time you cut to a new scene heading or a new line of dialogue, you are actually advancing the story in the same way a poet would in breaking a line or creating a stanza in their poem. And what's interesting about this as screenwriters is that often the idea doesn't come to us whole, right? So we might start out and be like, hey, I'm a director and I'm writing my own piece and it might be cool to do a oneer. But if that's all you're doing, then you're really just laying a gimmick on top of a script. So you have to ask yourself more questions. You have to ask yourself, what does it mean? What does it say in relationship to the story? Similarly, you might start off and not even have the idea of how you want it shot. You might simply start off with a character like this one who goes to a party because she wants to ask a guy to be her date for her sister's wedding. You might start like that and not know anything else. You might not know that they have a history. You might not know that there's a dream. You might not know that there's a projection. You might not know that there's more to the story than you're seeing. And as you start to develop that character and see the choices she makes, you might start to notice, oh, there are things that she's not seeing. And then you might start to ask yourself, what about the other characters? Are there things we're not seeing about them? And out of that, the way that the shots are going to be put together, the way that the images are going to be put together, the way that we're going to weave our way through the party might start to occur to you. And then finally, you bring in a beautiful director, or you're directing it yourself, and you go, you know what? This is a one. So this is what I want you to take from Erin Brown Thomas's beautiful film, Chasers. By the way, one of the producers is also a student at the studio. So a shout out to Olivia Holler and all the other wonderful people that I got to meet here at Sundance who are a part of this film. The thing that I want you to take is that it doesn't matter where you start. All you need to start is with one true thing. That one true thing might be, I have this crazy idea of how I want to shoot this. That one true thing might be, I know this about the character. That one true thing might be a scene that came to you, a moment that spoke to you, an image, a line of dialogue, anything. But in everything you build around it, remember that form is function. That all the little choices you make are all eventually going to dovetail around a theme about what you're really saying. And beyond all that, the thing that I think is coolest about Erin Brown Thomas and her team and what they did on this project is not only did they make a oneer for the tiniest fraction of a budget that anyone thinks you could do that with, they also had better marketing here at Sundance than a lot of films that had giant marketing budgets and PR people and much more powerful teams of much bigger and more famous stars. And it's one of the things I found so inspiring about Erin when I first met her. And one of the things I continue to find inspiring now as she's teaching for us is this philosophy that you can make almost anything work on almost any budget. If you are willing to work hard enough at it, get creative enough about it. But it's so important to remember that even when you're doing your marketing, even when you are pitching your script, even when you're figuring out, like Erin had to do, how do I turn this half-hour pilot into a series, that all the answers are in what already exists in the piece. That you're not trying to lay new ideas over because this would be cool, this would be cool, this would be cool, but rather that form and function should be one. That the things you are doing structurally, visually, even in your marketing, should be informed by the character, the journey, the theme, and what you want to say. The next movie at Sundance that I think you can learn a lot from is a movie called Ricky, produced by a friend of the studio, Ramphis Myrtle, who's also taught some classes for us and mentors some of our students, written by Lin Q. A. Young and Rashad Frett, who also directed the picture. Ricky started as a short that Ramphis produced back in 2023 that also made it all the way to Sundance. Completely different cast, although the title character, Ricky, does have a small part in the feature film. And what was incredible about Ricky, the short, is that it became a calling card that eventually led to the production of the feature. And this is something that I don't think that screenwriters think about enough. You don't have to wait for somebody to say yes. In fact, you can go out and produce your own short on a low budget, right? Make it a strong story that captures an audience and moves them. And what you've basically done is you basically proved, hey, this works. Hey, yeah, that did move you, right? Hey, you did want to see more of this. And that was the path that Ramphis and his team took on Ricky, and the results have been spectacular for them. Now, when we were talking about Erin Brown Thomas's piece, Chasers, we talked about this idea that form is function. And we talked about the idea in relation to that the ideas for where things go grow out of the places that you've already been. So in this case, you're adapting a short film that was designed to be, right, a full story with a catharsis, right, with an ending, a complete unit. And suddenly you got to turn it into a feature. So what do you do? How do you figure that out? The answers aren't out there. The answers are in the short. For those of you who have taken my Write Your TV series, you know that this concept called engine, right? The idea that when you're building a TV series, you need to identify what the engine that already exists in the pilot is. What is the engine? What are the combination of elements that made the pilot work, that made the pilot deliver a very specific feeling for the audience? And then as you develop each episode after that, you got to figure out a new combination of those elements that's going to create the same feeling in a slightly different way. Well, the same thing is true when you've written a short film and suddenly somebody wants a feature. Or in Erin's case, when you have written a short film and you realize, oh, it's 30 minutes long, it's going to have to be a pilot. And now you've got to generate an engine out of it. So how do you do that? Well, you look at what works. So Ricky the short is about a 30-year-old black man who has just been released from prison after spending the last 15 years there. When he was 15 years old, he committed a crime and was tried as an adult. And he has grown up in prison while all the people around him have grown up without him. And the short is just looking in at this period of time where he is trying to get a job, having just been released from prison. And his challenge, of course, is that he is locked in at the age of 15, right? That even though he is technically a 30-year-old man, the trauma of his past and the complete removal from society that he's experienced has basically locked him in at that age. So in creating the feature film, what Ramphis and his wonderful team and Rashad and then Q end up doing is taking those same elements and recombining them into a bigger journey. Because in Ricky, the feature film, we're going to watch Ricky finally grow up. We're going to watch Ricky deal with something that all people, but particularly people who have gone through trauma, deal with, right? Which is holding on to this more young version of themselves, right? And having that version still be active in their decision making. He finds himself in a really interesting situation where suddenly his younger brother, who's always been his younger brother, is now his older brother. His younger brother, who was a kid when he left, is now the one who's got to teach him how to drive, right? Ricky's got to go through his own coming of age story. He's got to deal with that 15-year-old inside of him. He's got to make peace with it in order to become a man. It's a moving story. Of course, it's also sociopolitically important because there's such a huge percentage of our society that is actually going through the experiences depicted in Ricky. And it's easy just to say they're bad, we're good, right? But one of the beautiful things that this film does and that you can do in your own film, your own TV show, is it takes somebody that we might judge as a criminal or as immature or as unreliable or as irresponsible, and it humanizes them. It shows us how hard it is for Ricky to be a man, how hard it is for Ricky to be responsible. And some of that is about his own emotional world being stuck in his past. Some is about the world around him being surrounded by people who love him, but who aren't fully reliable, who are trying to support him, but who are pushing him so hard that he ends up making terrible choices for fear of letting them down. And this is something I want you to think about in your own writing without giving away the plot of Ricky. Thinking about, number one, if you're starting adapting, whether it's adapting a short film, like in this case, or adapting some early pages you've written, or adapting a pilot into a series, a novel, a true life story, I want you to think about a couple of things that you can learn from Ricky. Number one, the answers you need are in what you've already written, right? If you love the novel, you love the play, you love the piece of history, you love the true life story, you love the short, you're trying to in some way recombine the elements that gave you that experience as you read it, saw it, created it, right? You're looking for what were the elements that created that emotional impact and how do I recombine them in order to build something bigger? What is missing from the character's journey? If in the case where you're trying to take something small and make it big, right? What is missing? Where has this piece not gone? In a feature film, that's where you have to go. And in a TV series, that's the North Star that you have to keep on pushing towards, even though the character can never get there, not until the finale. The second thing I want you to think about is that we all have the urge to judge our characters, right? To say, oh, they're that type of person. And there's a period where no matter who you're writing, there's a good chance you're going to fall out of love with them. You're going to start to judge them, right? You might judge them as a writer, right? They're not interesting enough. Their dialogue isn't cool enough. They're not specific enough, right? They're cliche. They're boring, right? They're not making big enough decisions, right? They're unlikable. You might have those kind of writerly judgment. Or you might have those more human judgment, those judgments that everyone in the world makes when we meet people, right? That we put them in a box. We're like, oh, he would never do that. But I saw him do it. But no, he wouldn't do that. It doesn't make sense. But I saw him do it, right? Where we want to push out elements of the character that are actually presenting us where the character needs to go. We want to push them out because they don't fit our vision of the character. Or we get frustrated with the character, right? Especially when you're developing true life stories and you thought you were writing a hero, and then as you start to really research, you realize, oh, they're human. They've got problems. They've got flaws. They've got failings. They have selfish parts of them, right? So we have this urge to judge, right? To fall out of love with our characters, either because we're falling out of love with our own writing because we haven't fully found them yet on the page, because we're afraid to honor our visions of where they might go because it doesn't fit our narrow conception of who we think the character is? Or because we start to realize that the character has levels, like every human being, that maybe don't fit with what we consider appropriate or right or the way we want them to be. And it's at your peril as a writer that you ignore these things, right? Without the conceit, without the conception that emotionally Ricky is stuck at 15 years old, this movie would be another rehashing of the Black experience in America. And that's really, really important. It's been done brilliantly in shows and movies like Blind Spotting. So you gotta find that thing. What makes Ricky different? What makes Ricky special? What makes Ricky more moving? And in this case, it's this simple but very beautiful idea that he is moving through life looking like a 30-year-old, but being a 15-year-old. That over the course of the movie, he is going to have the experiences that a 15-year-old naturally has. He's going to make the mistakes that a 15-year-old naturally makes, but he's going to be embroiled with his own shame because he thinks he's supposed to be something different than he is. And this is the last piece that I would like to share with you. Just like our characters are all carrying earlier versions of themselves, so are we. And there's a really easy tendency to reject those younger parts of ourselves, right? Because they do things that frustrate us, right? Because that part of you is thinking like a teenager and not like an adult at the age that you think you're supposed to be. There's a form of therapy that looks really deeply at this called internal family systems. And that work is even predated by the work of a brilliant theater director named Augusto Boal, who called this same concept the cop in the head and the rainbow of desire, and created a concept called the theater of the oppressed around it. But the idea is actually very simple and something you can harness right now, which is when you or your character are behaving in ways that you find abhorrent, that you judge, that you struggle with, that you don't understand, one of the easy questions that you can ask that will start to illuminate and humanize both yourself and the character is to go, let me let go of my judgment. What if I stopped calling the character lazy, which is going to lead you to create the stereotype of lazy? What if I stopped calling the character a criminal, which is going to lead you to create the stereotype of criminal? What if I stopped calling the character irresponsible, which is going to lead you to write the stereotype of irresponsible? What if instead I looked, listened, and felt my way until I could figure out where's the humanity in this character? What is the positive intention of this character? What is this character actually going for? How is this character actually trying to do good even as they make terrible mistakes? And one of the ways into that is you can simply ask yourself, what age is my character stuck at? What is the trauma that got them stuck there? And what would it take for them to face that trauma and find whatever lives on the other side? And of course, as a human being, maybe if you ask the same question of yourself, you will find a little thread of humanity that you didn't know existed there. Maybe you will find a peace that you didn't know you could have. Maybe you will find a freedom from your own judgment and your own shame that sets you free, not only as an artist, but also as a human being. The next movie we are going to talk about is one of my favorite films from Sundance. It's a beautiful Benedict Cumberbatch movie called The Thing with Feathers, written and directed by Dylan Southern. The Thing with Feathers is a meditation on grief. Grieving characters are the most challenging characters to write because they don't want to do things, right? Because grief is internal. Grief is not an action. Grief is a state. And this is true really for any emotion that you are trying to dramatize as a screenwriter. Emotions are states, and movies are movement. Now, there are some states that lead themselves towards movement, right? Excitement leads towards movement. Love leads towards movement. In fact, we talk about these kinds of emotions and in a category that we call emotional needs here at the studio, right? These core primal needs that drive us. I need love. I need comfort. I need justice. I need respect. We're talking about those kinds of elements. Those are needs from somebody. But grief is a different kind of emotion. It's not an emotional need. It's just a state. It's an emotional feeling. And when you have an emotional feeling inside your character, when anything is going on inside of your character, your job is to dramatize it. Your job is to take the internal and externalize it. This is the central job of a screenwriter, and it's the biggest difference between a screenwriter and a novelist. A novelist goes inside, right? You can use language and you can go into the heads of the character. You can have an omniscient narrator. You can have a first person, a third person narrator, and you can see, feel, hear all the things going on in their head. In a movie, we can't do that. And therefore, the state of grief is a dangerous state to try to write. So we've got to take that state and we've got to bring it out of the character. And we've got to figure out, even in that state of grief, what does the character want? In The Thing with Feathers, this is handled in two really beautiful ways. The first is at the very beginning, by making it extremely, exquisitely clear what the character wants. What the character wants is to keep things normal for his boys. His wife has died. He has 2 young children. And he is trying to keep things normal. It's almost a super dark version of Mr. Mom from the 80s, right? Suddenly dad is in charge and he's ill-equipped. He's ill-equipped because he's never played this role before. And he's ill-equipped because his grief is the obstacle, right? So there's the physical obstacle of just struggling to make toast and get the kids ready for school. There's the emotional obstacle of the dissonance, the cognitive dissonance between what has just happened and needing to keep things normal. The growing awareness that the world is falling apart and that he is not able to function in the way he used to, based on the third obstacle, which is the internal obstacle, which is the state of grief. But even then, the writer needs to find another way to even further externalize this internal thing. And the way he does it in this movie that's so beautiful is by actually taking that grief state and blowing it into reality. Now, in The Thing with Feathers, this is done through magical realism. The main character, Benedict Cumberbatch, is a comic book artist. And in the wake of his wife's death, he is compulsively drawing a crow. And that crow comes into his world, first in the form of a bird and then in the form of a giant, larger than man-sized bird. One of the beautiful choices that Dylan Southern made as a director was he shot it in that old TV format, that square format that we don't see very often anymore. And because of the costume design of the crow, there's a curve to that costume, like a crow neck on a man's body. And what that does is in each frame, we can feel the crow, this embodiment of the main character's grief, enveloping him, enveloping his family. And what's really interesting about this is that he doesn't know if the crow is a demon haunting him. Is it an obstacle to his recovery? Or is it actually the spiritual guide that he needs to follow? In this way, the film kind of evokes some of the world that we saw in Pan's Labyrinth, right? Where this dark, complicated faun is testing a little girl who doesn't know if her real challenge is to listen to the faun or to refuse him, but who wants her fairy kingdom. In that movie, we also have magical realism. We have the magical realism where it's externalizing the internal dream, right? So if you think about Pan's Labyrinth, what does the little girl want? Her dad died and her mom has remarried a fascist. And what she wants is her dad back. But that gets externalized in a magical realism way to be the dream for a fairy kingdom. And so this internal thing becomes external, and that gives the character something to move through. It gives them a relationship. In Pan's Labyrinth, it's with the fawn. In The Thing with Feathers, it's with the crow. And just like the character in Pan's Labyrinth, the dream, the wish, is to keep things the way they used to be, to keep things normal for the children, but he is breaking down, his home is breaking down, he is not equipped, and there's a freaking crow of grief tormenting him. Or maybe trying to heal him. And he has this desire, so a new want grows out of it. He wants to rid himself of the crow. And the crow at one point in the movie has this deeply haunting line where it says, "There are much worse than me." And later, that much worse than me, when he finally does banish the crow, is going to materialize into his world. This is what's really beautiful. When we talked about Ricky, we talked about characters being stuck in a certain place, right? And that we need to humanize them and that we have an urge to judge them. The Thing with Feathers takes us to a whole nother level because it's using these horror tropes that we've seen before. It keeps on dipping towards horror. The man is being haunted by a crow, and we get it. The crow is his grief, right? And we know he needs to banish his grief. We believe he has to banish his grief. But the real answer is so much more complicated than that. In a way, this film is also built a little bit like Inside Out. This is a character with a misbelief. It is built around his misbelief that he has to keep things the way they used to be, his misbelief that he has to be who he was before this loss, his misbelief that he has to banish the crow that is haunting him, when really the answer is so much more complicated. It's really interesting to see a film. As I watched The Thing with Feathers, I kept waiting for the real horror to come. And there are moments where they certainly do feed that genre monster. But the intentions, again, we talked about form is function when we talked about Erin Brown Thomas's piece, Chasers, right? In this case, again, the form is function. The form of the horror. And yes, once you introduce horror, you gotta go to horror places. And they do. The demon is going to emerge. But the purpose of the horror, this is not a Monster in the House movie. This is not Hereditary. This is not Longlegs, right? This is not Freddy Krueger or Jason or or Scream. The function of the horror is to externalize the state of grief and the internal struggle that this man and his children are going through to recapture who he used to be, a thing that he is not going to be able to recapture. That he instead is going to have to move to the other side of that. So the film is actually built around the different stages of grief. It's really interesting to watch because in each stage they make sure to actually name the stage. He actually expresses the stage so we can feel him moving through his grief. So it's rooted in this real psychology. Again, form and function merging. And yet it's this wild, crazy, odd, strange little moving movie that is going to leave you sobbing at the end. And the last lesson I'd like you to take from this is sometimes we have the urge, a giant crow, which is literally in this film, a man in a costume, shows up in your script about grief, your little character-driven drama about grief, and you think, oh my God, what's wrong? I can't do that. Can't do that. I'm trying to write a character-driven drama. But it's at your peril that you ignore that. Right? When you see, feel, hear something, it's so important that you get it out onto the page. And then you can start to build around it. And again, we've seen a lot of movies about grief, but this one transforms our expectations, right? By following that impossible path that maybe never would have occurred to you, right? that doesn't fit the things that you normally see in movies. Now, does that mean that every movie, to externalize the internal, needs to become blown up to a state of magical realism? No. If that crow shows up and you write that and you realize that's not what I want, you can say, okay, well, what's the human version of this? What's the drama version of this? If that crow was a human being, who would that human being be? If the demon was a human being, who would that human being be? If you are a lover of magical realism, like I am, you can follow that path and write a movie like The Thing with Feathers. Or you can recognize that when you see these wild things that you want to say no to because they don't fit, you can realize that these are your metaphors, that you're actually externalizing your own metaphors as a writer. And that presents you with a tremendous opportunity by following that crazy path when it occurs to you. And they actually present the path that you're actually looking for. Again, our job is to externalize the internal, right? To understand the metaphors that are driving the character, whether that's I'm stuck at age 15 in Ricky, whether that is I don't know if I'm chasing my dreams or chasing my own abuse in Chasers, or in this film, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this bird that seems to be destroying my life, right? That all we're doing is we're following the metaphor, whether that metaphor occurs to you in a naturalism form, right? In something that looks like reality, or whether that's blown out into the mythical proportions that we see here in The Thing with Feathers. The purpose of the horror of The Things with Feathers is to drop us into the grief and the journey that the character is going through. We are looking at the horror of grief, not the horror of a slasher film. Again, we're coming back to this idea of form as function. The purpose of your script is to dramatize something that is true inside of you. And all of the decisions you make, from magical realism to how you're going to shoot it, to what the internal state that's holding back your character and how you're going to externalize it, those all grow out of form and function merging for you as a writer. So this is part one of the Lessons from Sundance 2025 podcast. We're going to be back next episode with more movies and powerful lessons that you can learn from the filmmakers at Sundance 2025, whether you have seen these movies or not. So I hope that you've enjoyed this podcast. If it is helping your writing, then come study with us. We have a free class every Thursday Night Writes, as well as an incredible program called ProTrack that will pair you one-on-one with a professional writer who will mentor you through your entire career, meet with you every week or every other week, and give you the guidance you need to get to where you need to go, just like these wonderful filmmakers from Sundance.